Hi, my name is Nick Cooney, and I'm the author of Change of Heart, What Psychology Can Teach Us About Spreading Social Change. The premise of the book is a pretty simple one. It's that those of us who are trying to spread some type of progressive social change can be more effective in the work that we're doing if we take the time to learn about human psychology and what really motivates attitude and behavior change. All of us want some type of change in the world, whether that's protection for animals or the environment, advancing social justice or equality, or some other cause. Certainly there's some change that we want to see. But the question is how? How to create that change that we want to see in the world. Those of us who consider ourselves advocates for a particular cause often have some myths that we will sometimes tell ourselves about whether or not and how our movements will win. For example, we sometimes tell ourselves that our movement will win because we're right, we're on the side of justice. That sounds nice, it sounds warm and fuzzy, but the reality is that if you look to history, or even if you look to the current day, there are plenty of situations where those who are on the side of right, those who are on the side of justice and compassion and truth, did not win. They lost. It's unfortunate, but that is the world that we live in. So just because we're on the right side does not mean that our cause is going to win automatically. We also like to sometimes tell ourselves that our cause is going to win because we're so passionate and dedicated. Again, passion and dedication are very helpful, but the reality is that there's thousands and probably millions of people who feel very differently from us and who are working to create a very different world than we would like to have created. So passion and dedication are very useful, but that alone does not mean that we as a movement or we in our social cause are going to be successful. The philosopher Jean-Paul Sartre once wrote that the revolution is not a question of virtue, but of effectiveness. Not a question of virtue, but of effectiveness. What he was saying is that what's important is not how pure we are in our beliefs or how passionate we are about our cause. What's really important is how effective we are in bringing about that change that we want to see in the world. Which again brings us back to that question, how? How do we most effectively create that world that we want to see? Those who go into any type of professional field have a knowledge base that they need to learn before entering their field. For example, a doctor has to go to medical school for 5 years before he or she can walk into the operating room. A lawyer has to go to law school for 3 years, has to learn how to do legal research, how to argue a case, and so forth. An engineer has all sorts of scientific information they need to learn and master and pass a test before they're allowed to design a building. And for Hollywood actors, of course, it helps to learn where you can score the best cocaine. But what about those of us who are advocates for a particular cause? What is our knowledge base? What is that body of scientific and technical knowledge that we should be taking the time to learn in order to succeed in our work? I would submit to you that that knowledge base, that body of knowledge, is psychology, and more specifically, information about how we can most effectively change the attitudes and behaviors of the general public. Let's face it, we can't create social change without changing individual hearts and minds. Whether that's getting individuals to change their behaviors, or even creating more widespread change like new laws or getting policy changes at companies. Each one of those changes, large or small, require changing attitudes and changing behaviors on an individual by individual basis. Psychology is really a roadmap to social change. Just as we wouldn't get into a car and drive to a town we'd never been to before without first looking up the directions. Similarly, it would be a little presumptuous of us to think that we can get someone to go from attitude A to attitude B, or behavior A to behavior B, without understanding how attitude and behavior change happen, what works and what doesn't work, and trying to motivate them. Now, a lot of us think that we understand how the human mind works. And it's an understandable assumption because we all have brains. We've lived with them our whole lives. We think we understand how our minds work, and so we assume we know how other minds work as well. But as always, when we assume, we tend to make an ass out of you and me, and in this situation is no different. A lot of our perceptions about human psychology and about what motivates behavior and attitude change are called naive psychology, misperceptions, commonly held misperceptions about what really motivates change. Let me give you an example. Let's turn to the field of energy conservation. One big question for environmental advocates is, how can we get more homeowners to conserve energy in their houses? Well, researchers wanted to put that to the test empirically, so they started by polling a number of homeowners asking them if they, in fact, try to conserve energy, and if they said yes, asking them the reasons why they conserved. The main reasons that homeowners stated were either to protect the environment, to save money, or to benefit the community. Researchers, however, weren't so sure that these people really knew their motivations on why they were conserving energy. So, they conducted the second part of their study. The researchers created 4 flyers. One spoke about the environmental reasons to conserve, one spoke about the financial reasons, one spoke about the benefits to the community, and one flyer simply stated that the vast majority of people already conserve energy in that community. They then went around to homeowners in a particular neighborhood and gave each homeowner just one of these flyers. They worked with the local utility company to then monitor actual energy use over the next 3 months. And do you want to take a guess as to which one of these flyers actually created the most change in terms of getting homeowners to conserve energy? If you guessed the 4th flyer, you're right. In fact, of all 4 of the flyers, only the 4th one, the one that had the so-called social norms message, or a message about what other people are doing, only the 4th flyer created any measurable reduction in energy use in the homes that received one of these 4 flyers. Now, if you were running an environmental organization and you were trying to promote home energy conservation, chances are, if you were making a leaflet, speaking to the media, or putting out any other type of communication, chances are that you would use either an environmental message or perhaps appeal to people's financial self-interest in trying to get them to conserve. But as the study shows, that instinct about what sort of message is going to be most effective at creating behavior change turned out to not be correct, not by a long shot. Environmental organizations, based on the results of this study, will probably be more effective using a social norms message than any of those other messages. This is just one example of how our instincts about what messages we should use and about what it takes to create attitude and behavior change are often incorrect. So turning to research that's been done in the field of psychology and sociology and related disciplines can give us some fact-based answers about what messages, what approaches, what techniques work and don't work in creating attitude and behavior change and in bringing about that world that we want to see. What we're going to do now is we're going to look at some tools and techniques that those of us who are advocates for a particular cause can use to be more effective in the work that we're trying to do. After that, we'll take a few minutes to look at our own psychology, because it's important not only to understand how to influence and persuade others, but also to understand what our motivations are for wanting to create some type of social change. Because our psychology can either help or hinder our efforts to bring about that world that we want to see. So let's look at some techniques now for helping create attitude and behavior change in the general public. Let's talk a little more about social norms. As we saw in the previous example, social norms can be a very powerful tool to use in trying to bring about behavior change. We all like to think that we're very independent people, that we have the opinions we have and we choose the lifestyle we choose because we've thought about it and we've come to our own independent conclusions. But the reality is that we're very, very influenced by what other people are doing, especially people in our own peer group. So using social norms messages can be very effective. In fact, in many situations, they've been found to be more effective than the message that the cause itself is promoting, be it environmentalism, protection of animals, or anything else. Let me give you some examples from the research. There was a hotel that wanted their guests to begin reusing their bath towels each night. The main reason was to save money. It costs a lot of money for the water and for the electricity to wash and dry the towels every single night. But of course there would be an environmental benefit if guests reused their towels as well. Less water used, less electricity used. So the hotel put little signs in each room in the hotel that said, in order to protect the environment, we encourage you to please reuse your bath towels. And the signs did work. Some people did reuse their bath towels. But then researchers came in and they changed the signs. They took away the environmental message and instead, in each room, there was now a little sign that simply said, most guests in this hotel reused their bath towels. Nothing about the environment, just that one short social norms message. And switching from an environmental to a social norms message increased towel reuse by about 26% in that hotel. And in fact, when the message was made even more specific, to say most guests in this particular hotel room, room 306 or whatever room it may be, most guests in this hotel room reuse their towels. Towel reuse increased even more to a total of 33% over the original environmental message. Here's another example. The Red Cross was doing a blood drive on a college campus, and they wanted to try to figure out a way to get more students to donate blood this year. Working with researchers, they made one slight change to their promotions about the event. When they put up their posters, instead of just announcing the time and date and location of the blood drive, this time they also put up pictures showing students donating blood from the previous year. In other words, they were showing students that there was a social norm to donate blood, that other students were already doing it. Adding those images, which invoke social norms, increased the number of students who donated blood that year by almost 20%. Social norms are a very powerful tool. A lot of times, the message that we think is going to be most effective, appealing to people's compassion or concern for the environment or animals or the poor or any other group, sometimes using a social norms message will actually be more effective than using a cause-based message. And getting people to change their behavior can get people to be more likely to later change their attitude as well in the direction we'd like it to change. So social norms messages can be a great tool to get people started down the road we want them to travel down. Let's turn now to commitment. Commitment is another very powerful tool that we can use to help bring about social change. Commitment is something that we probably already use in our own lives. For example, if I have to move next week and I go up to a friend and I say, hey, would you be able to help give me a hand moving next Saturday? And he says, okay, I can probably help you out. And I respond, are you sure? I really need your help. I really need somebody. It's going to be next Saturday at 1 o'clock. You sure you can do it? And he'll say, okay, yep, 1 o'clock next Saturday, I'll be there. What I've got him to do is I've got him to give a verbal commitment that he will in fact come out and help me move. And in getting that commitment, I actually have made it more likely that he will follow through and help me with my move. There's a lot of research to document the impact that commitments have on getting people to keep their word and follow through on some type of behavior change. For example, there was a restaurant that was having a problem in that many people were calling and making reservations and then simply not showing up. Obviously, this was not very good for the restaurant. It meant empty tables, and that meant money lost. So, working with researchers, the restaurant implemented a very small change. When people called to make a reservation, the workers at the restaurant took the reservation, but they finished the phone call by adding one little question at the end. They asked the person on the other line, if you change your plans, will you let us know? And they waited for the patron to say, yes, I'll let you know if I change my plans. Simply asking that one little question and getting a commitment from patrons reduced the no-show rate from 30% down to 10%. Big change for very little effort. Another very similar example. Again, a Red Cross example. The Red Cross was phone banking, calling people trying to get them to come out and donate blood at a drive that was going to happen the next day. Working with researchers, they made one little adjustment to their typical procedure, and that is, at the end of the phone call, they added the sentence, we'll count on seeing you then, okay? And waiting for a response. Adding that one little sentence and letting the person on the other end of the line say, yes, I'll be there, increased the show-up rate by over 20%. Let me give you one more example of commitment in action. Another big question for the environmental movement is how can we get more people to take public transportation? Well, researchers wanted to put this to the test empirically. So what they did is they approached 4 groups of people with 4 different approaches. The first group was given information. They were given route and schedule information about the public bus system in the town they lived in. A second group in the same town was asked to make a verbal commitment to ride the bus more often. A third group was given 10 free bus tickets and told that they could get more free tickets in the future. And a fourth group was both given the free tickets and asked to make the verbal commitment to ride the bus more often. Of these 4 groups, do you want to take a guess as to which ended up riding the bus the most over the next 3 months? As it turns out, those who made the verbal commitment and those who both got the free tickets and also made the verbal commitment were the groups that ended up riding the bus the most often. So what we can tell from this is that it wasn't the free tickets, but actually the verbal commitment that got people to follow through and ride the bus more often. This certainly goes against probably most of our intuitions about what would be most effective at getting people to ride the bus. If I ran a bus system, I probably would never even thought of trying to use commitment as a tool to get people on the buses. I certainly would have assumed that giving away free tickets would be a far more effective technique. But again, many times our intuitions about what's most useful in getting people to change their attitudes and behaviors is incorrect. And again, that's why looking to the research in the fields of psychology and sociology and related fields can make us much more effective in the work that we do. So whatever our cause is, getting people to make a commitment can be a powerful tool for getting them to carry out the behavior change that we'd like them to carry out. Whether that's a personal commitment, a group commitment, a written commitment, or a public commitment. All of these types of commitments have been found time and time again in the research to be effective at getting people to carry out and stick with a behavior change. Let's turn now to foot in the door. One question that advocates of any cause often have to answer for themselves is whether it's better to ask for a small change or ask for a large change of the general public. Those who would say it's better to ask for a small change reason that it's easy to get people to make a small change, and once they make that small change, maybe they'll go on to make larger changes. On the other hand, those who say we should ask for a very large change think that if we ask for a small change, people might make that change, but then they'll think they've done enough. They'll become complacent, and they won't have really done very much to promote whatever cause we're trying to advance. Research on the foot in the door technique can give us a lot of fact-based information about the answer to this question that we often struggle with. Let me give you an example of what I mean by foot in the door technique. Researchers wanted to see how they could get homeowners in a particular neighborhood to put up yard signs in their front yard that encouraged the public to drive safely. So they went around to a particular neighborhood, they knocked on doors, and they asked homeowners to put these yard signs out in their front yard. But the signs were fairly ugly, so only 17% of residents agreed to do that. Researchers then went to other homes in the same neighborhood, but this time they left the yard signs at home and they brought with them little 3-inch by 3-inch window stickers that simply said, "We encourage safe driving." Knocked on doors, asked homeowners to put up these little window stickers, and virtually all agreed to do so. 3 weeks later, researchers went back to those same homes, and this time they brought with them the yard signs. They knocked on doors and said, "Hey, thank you for putting up those little window stickers a few weeks ago. Now we were wondering if you would put these yard signs out in the front yard." And this time, a full 76% agreed to put the yard signs out. In other words, researchers got a foot in the door by first making a very small request. Once they had that foot in the door, they were much more likely to get the larger request made. So even though their ultimate goal was to get people to put the yard signs out in the front yard, it turned out that they would be much more effective at that if they first made a much smaller request and then later made the real request. Let me give you a few other examples of foot in the door technique from the research. Another study found that getting people to sign a petition supporting the building of a handicapped recreation center made it more likely that people would later then donate to support the construction of that recreation center. In fact, those who signed the petition first and a few weeks later were asked to donate were almost twice as likely to donate as those who never signed the petition. Similarly, people who were asked to wear a pin about the Canadian Cancer Society were, a few weeks later, almost twice as likely to donate to the Canadian Cancer Society when asked. Research on foot in the door technique has been extensive and it's gone on for decades. In fact, there's over 1,000 studies that have been conducted on the foot in the door technique. A meta-analysis of all these studies found that overall, making that small request first and then later making a real larger request increased compliance with that larger request by about 11%. So in other words, using foot in the door will overall make us about 10 or 11% more effective. And as we can see from some of these examples, in certain situations, foot in the door is much, much more effective even than that. Why does foot in the door work? Why would getting someone to make a small, even symbolic change make them more likely to make a larger and more substantial change a few weeks or a few months or a few years down the line? The foot in the door technique works because it influences people's self-identity. Once they've made a small change, even a symbolic change, they start to see themselves in a slightly different manner. They start to see themselves as, oh, I guess I'm the sort of person who cares about safe driving because I put that little window sticker in my window. Or, I must be the sort of person who cares about fighting cancer because I'm wearing this Canadian Cancer Society pin. So getting them to make a small little change, even if it's somewhat insignificant, can start to influence their self-identity. And then later when they're asked to make that larger change, because it's consistent with their new identity, the more likely to make that change. One very important thing to note with foot in the door technique is that the larger change doesn't happen automatically. It only happens if we later go back and make the larger request. So simply encouraging the public to make a small change doesn't mean that they're going to make that change and then go on to make larger changes on their own. Foot in the door only works if we make the small request, wait for some time to pass, and then specifically encourage those same individuals to now make a much larger behavior change. Foot in the door is a technique that can be very useful in our efforts to create social change. Whatever behavior change we're trying to encourage the public to make, in many situations it could be helpful, and we might be more effective if we first ask for a small change, and then later follow up with those same individuals and encourage them to make a larger change, the real change that we want them to make. Let's move on. Have you seen the movie An Inconvenient Truth by Al Gore? If you have, you may remember that towards the end, there's a list of 20 things that any one of us can do to help reduce our own personal impact on global warming. Giving a list of things that individuals can do to make a change or to help some social cause is something that nonprofits do all the time. The logic seems straightforward. The more choices we give somebody, the more likely they are to see at least one choice or two choices that fit with them and their lifestyle and that they'll be willing to make. Actually, the research shows the exact opposite to be the case. Research shows that the more choices we give people, the less likely they are to choose any of those options. Here are some examples from the research. A study of over 800,000 employees found that the more retirement funds that were offered to employees of a particular company, the less likely employees at that company were to choose any retirement fund whatsoever. In other words, those companies that just had one or two retirement funds had a lot of employees picking a retirement fund and beginning to save. Whereas those companies that offered a dozen or more retirement plans, very few of those employees actually picked a plan and began saving. Here's another example. A group of college students was given this scenario. Okay, you're planning on studying tonight in the library, but you just found out that this film that you really want to see is going to be playing on campus tonight only. So do you stick with your initial plan to study, or do you go and see that movie that you've really been wanting to see? Only 20% said that they would stay and study. 80% said, I'm going to go off and I'm going to do the fun thing and watch that movie, even though I wasn't planning on it. Another group of college students was given a similar but slightly different scenario. They were told, okay, your plan tonight was to study in the library, but you just found out that this movie is going to be playing on campus for tonight only. And you also found out that the speaker who you've really been wanting to see is also going to be on campus for tonight only. So what do? In this situation, where they were given not one but two good alternatives to studying, more chose to stay and study. In fact, in this situation, 40% chose to stay and study, and only 60% chose one of the other two fun activities. If we're trying to get the public to make a change or to support our cause, instead of giving them a long laundry list of things they can do, just give them one or two or at very most 3 things to pick from. The 1 or 2 or 3 most effective things that they could do. Giving a small list of options should get more of the public to pick any of those options and follow through with it than giving them a long list. Telling stories. As you probably know, stories are very important. We often base our sense of ourself and our sense of life on narratives that we tell about ourselves and about the world that we live in. For hundreds of thousands of years, stories were the way that information was passed down from one generation to the next. So stories can be very powerful in helping to promote our cause, especially in getting people to support us with donations. Here's an example from the research. I'm sure that if you're like me and most other people, you get letters in the mail from different nonprofits asking you to make a donation. Researchers wanted to see what type of donation letters were most effective in getting people to donate. So they prepared 3 different letters about the same social problem, namely starvation in Africa. The first letter gave information, statistical information, about how widespread starvation was in Africa. It talked about the millions of people who faced starvation, about the numbers of hundreds of thousands who were displaced by famine and war, and gave other general information, statistical information, that gave a good sense of the overall problem of starvation. The second letter focused on one child, one specific child that was undergoing starvation and what life was like for her. A third letter combined both the story about the young child and the statistical information. Would you want to take a guess as to which one of those letters got the most people to donate the greatest amount of money? It actually was the second letter, the one that only included a personal story. People donated about twice as much when they got the story letter as they did when they got the statistics-based letter. And in fact, those who got a letter that had both the story and the statistics only donated slightly more than those who got the statistics-only letter. So telling a story was much more effective at getting people to donate than giving statistical information. It seems somewhat counterintuitive. You would think that if people heard that tens of millions of people are facing starvation, it would make them more likely to donate than simply hearing about one individual who is facing starvation. But again, our intuition about what motivates people is not always accurate. One researcher worked with a classroom of university students, and he had each student in the classroom give a presentation on a topic of his or her choice. Afterwards, he polled all the students to see what they remembered of the other presentations they had heard that day. What he found was that only 5% of students remembered any statistic from one of the other presentations, whereas over 60% remembered the stories that they had heard that day. The takeaway for those of us who are trying to create social change is that if we're trying to persuade the public, get them to change their attitude or behavior, or donate to support our cause, rather than launching into a long explanation with statistics and analysis about the problem, will be more effective if we focus on one individual and give a story about what that person goes through. Whether it's a child in a sweatshop, an animal on a factory farm, or any other individual that we can focus on. By focusing on an individual and by using a story, we'll be more effective at getting people to support us and support our cause. Let's look at one last technique, and I call it don't deny it. If you look around the internet or in literature that nonprofit organizations put out, you'll often see a facts versus myths presentation that nonprofits will use to try to educate the public about their particular cause. For example, a Google search turns up fact versus myth presentations by the NRA, National Geographic Magazine, various governmental organizations, pro and anti-abortion groups, marijuana reform organizations, and all sorts of others. It's very common. Again, the logic behind it seems pretty simple. The nonprofit has an issue where they think there's some misunderstandings that the public has, so they list some myths and then they give the facts about the situation to correct those misunderstandings. Seems like a common sense approach. But research shows that it's actually a very bad way of trying to educate the public about an issue. One particular researcher took a facts versus myth flyer that was actually produced and distributed by the Center for Disease Control. It was a flyer that was given facts and myths about the flu vaccine. The CDC was trying to address some fears and concerns that the public had about the safety of that vaccine. The researcher gave this flyer to a number of people, and then he tracked their understanding of the issue over the next few days and a few weeks. And what he found was that while initial understanding was very accurate, after only a few days had passed, people's understandings of the flyer and the information on it began to shift. Most of the true statements, in fact virtually all of them, were correctly remembered to be true statements. But of the myths that were given, a number of them, about 40%, were incorrectly remembered as true. Not only were individuals now thinking false statements were true, but they thought that their source of their information was the very believable and trustworthy Center for Disease Control. So the takeaway for those of us who are trying to create some type of social change is that if we're trying to educate the public about the issue, this particular issue, we should not give a facts versus myth or true and false presentation. Instead of repeating falsehoods and myths, we should simply state and explain the truths. It will be much more effective if we do that in getting the public to accurately understand the situation and to dispel the myths that really are out there. We've talked about some tools and techniques in influencing others, and in my book Change of Heart, I go a lot more further into other techniques. But let's take a few minutes now to look at our own psychology, about what motivates us to try to create some type of social change. Facing ourselves is sometimes hard to do. We want to think that we're just very altruistic people and our only motivation is we want to create a better world for animals, the planet, for people. But the reality is that we often have a lot of motivations that cause us to be involved in the particular cause that we're involved in. Doing good is certainly one motivation. That's certainly, I think, part of what is driving all of us to want to create some type of change. But those other motivations can include wanting to express ourselves, wanting to feel a sense of belonging by being around others who feel similar to how we do, and wanting to feel good about ourselves, feel that we're doing the right thing. Let's look at how some of those motivations, while all very important, let me reiterate that all of these things, all of these motivations are motivations that we all have in life and that we all need to satisfy to live a happy and meaningful life. But there are times when these motivations can get in the way of that other motivation of doing good. So let me give some examples. Expressing ourselves. We all want to be heard. We all want the world to know what we think and what we feel about any particular issue. But sometimes if our main goal is to express ourselves and not necessarily to do the most good, we can run into some problems. For example, in our interactions with other people, what's going through our minds is, I really want to get this other person to know what I think and what I believe, because what I think and what I believe are right. If our main goal is letting the other person know exactly what we think and letting them know why they are wrong, then we're probably not going to do a very good job of getting them to agree to our position. It'd be better to have less of a focus on expressing ourselves and more of a focus on, okay, what can I say and how can I communicate with this person in a way that's going to get them to be most likely to agree to what I'm trying to say and to change their attitude and behavior. So that's one situation where expressing ourselves can go up against a goal of trying to get the person to actually make a change. Appearance. Our appearance is a reflection of ourselves. It's a reflection of our sense of style. Many times in situations it can be a reflection of our economic status, of the sort of person that we are, our personality. And so most of us, in either small or large ways, alter our appearance to reflect ourselves and our tastes and who we are and who we associate with. But again, sometimes this self-expression can get in the way of creating social change. There's situations where our physical appearance will get others to tune us out and not listen to us. It's unfortunate that that's the way the world is. It's unfortunate that people are judged on their looks. But research and common sense has found time and time again that people do in fact judge others based on their appearance. And so if our appearance is drastically different than what our public is used to seeing, or makes them think that we're a very different type of person than they are, they're going to be less likely to hear our message and to make the attitude and behavior change that we'd like them to make. So, if we want to be as effective as possible in getting the public to adopt new attitudes and new behaviors, we should work to change our appearance so that it's similar to whatever audience we're working with at the moment. Sometimes this means dressing nicer, sometimes it means dressing down, or just dressing differently. I know this can be hard to do. It took me years to cut my hair and to adopt a more conventional way of dressing. But ultimately, if we really want to create change, and if we really want to get people to change their attitudes and behaviors, changing our appearance really will make them more receptive to our message, and it will do more good in the real world. Lastly, venue. How do we choose to express ourselves? What type of activism do we engage in? Sometimes our desire to express ourselves takes precedent, and so we'll choose the advocacy methods that are easiest for us, or that feel the best. For example, it might be easy to write a letter to a congressperson, and so we choose to do that because we're able to express ourselves in that letter, and our concern is with getting our opinion out there, regardless of the consequences. Or perhaps we like to express ourselves in a different way by standing on a corner with a sign and a bullhorn, screaming and shouting and getting our message across and getting our emotions out that way. Either of these, in some situations, can be useful tools for creating social change. But if our main goal is to express ourselves, and we're choosing the venue that enables us to express ourselves in the way we'd like, sometimes that goal is going to conflict with the goal of doing the most good. So we have to be careful. We have to be very thoughtful about what types of venues we choose to pursue in trying to advance whatever cause it is we're working on. Are we picking the tactics and the venues that we think are really going to create the most change? Or are we picking the tactics and venues that are most comfortable for us and that allow us to express ourselves in the way we'd like to express ourselves. Let's move on. Belonging is very important. All of us as human beings, as social animals, want to belong. We want to be around others who are similar to us, or at least a number of people who think and have similar values to ours. It's a very important part of being human, but again, this is an issue where that desire for belonging can sometimes conflict with a desire to do good. For example, a lot of times we may join an organization or a group or even just a network of friends where the reason we initially join is because we share some common goal, some social goal that we want to happen. But then the power of social bonds take over, and what began as a connection that was based on desiring to create some type of social change shifts. And so now we spend most of our time engaging in social functions with these people, hanging out, talking, swapping stories, and so forth, forgetting about the initial reason that drove us to connect to like-minded people. Another problem with belonging is that we all have a bias of concern. For one, we as human beings tend to be concerned with issues that affect those who are similar to us. For example, if you look at donations in the United States, the vast majority go to people, and the vast majority of those donations that go to people go to Americans and American nonprofit organizations, even though the vast majority of suffering in the world is had by people in third world or so-called third world countries. If you look back to those donations, again, the vast majority go to people, whereas only a very small percentage go to protecting the environment and animals, even though the environment is in a catastrophic state, and even though animals suffer tremendously and with very little legal protection. Again, we tend to care about those who are similar to us, and people are clearly more similar than a tree or a river or an animal. Even if we look to those donations towards animals, the vast majority go to animals that we're used to, cats and dogs, whereas a very small portion of donations go to help, say, farm animals, even though farm animals suffer in exponentially larger numbers and suffer to a much greater degree than companion animals. So if we're trying to do good, we have to ask ourselves, why have we picked the particular group and the particular cause that we're focused on? Is it just because they're similar to us? Is there another group that could stand to use our help much more and could benefit much more from our involvement? Another bias of concern that we have is that we're often drawn to issues that friends of ours are drawn to, or we're drawn to issues that are in the media a lot, so-called flashpoint issues. These are sometimes good as an initial issue for us to get involved with and to get us active and trying to create some type of social change, but a lot of times we could be more effective by focusing on issues that don't get as much attention. Let me give you an example. I live in Philadelphia, and a few years ago, the Philadelphia Eagles football team hired Michael Vick to be their quarterback. It generated a lot of controversy because Michael Vick had just gotten out of jail, where he spent 2 years behind bars for running a dogfighting ring and taking part in the torture and killing of dozens of dogs. Now, a lot of Philadelphians were very unhappy with the Eagles for hiring Vick. There were protests outside of Eagles training camp. There was letters to the editor and news stories all across the city for weeks and even months about the issue, with people venting their outrage and frustration. It would have been very easy to jump on that Michael Vick bandwagon of condemning him and condemning the Eagles, but it really wouldn't do very much good for animals. If someone really wanted to help pit bulls and help prevent dogfighting, they would have been much more effective by simply joining up with a local SPCA or with pit bull rescue organizations to try to find homes for rescued dogs and to try to locate and shut down existing pit bull rings in the city. But again, the issues that generate the most attention are the ones that often generate our involvement, but they may not be the issues where we can do the most good. Feeling good. Of course, we all want to feel good. We all want to feel like we're doing something good to help the world. But again, this is a situation where that desire to feel good can sometimes conflict with the desire to actually do good. The attitude that we should do something, do anything to improve the world. That it doesn't matter so much what we do as that we are doing something is somewhat of a popular idea. It's a slogan that you hear a lot. It's a slogan that's appealing because it takes away any pressure that we might feel trying to figure out how we can actually create change in the world. Instead of being frustrated by our failed attempts, we can adopt the idea that, well, as long as we're doing something, we can feel good about ourselves. Unfortunately, this is really letting ourselves off the hook. If this is our attitude, if our attitude is just to do something, do anything, or just do good and whatever happens, happens, then clearly our desire is just to feel good about ourselves and not to create actual change in the world. Creating change is much harder. It demands dealing with frustration at failure. It demands putting in the time and effort to first consider what issue we want to work on, and where we feel we can do the most good, and then working for months and years to try to figure out the best ways to actually create change. Our motivation shouldn't just be to do good. Our motivation should be to do the most good. And hopefully all of us who are advocates for a particular cause can move in that direction as much as possible. We should be trying to do the most good, creating the most actual change in the world. How can we do that? How can any of us determine what's better than something else? How can we know if one issue is better to work on than another one? Well, the answer is by turning to a bottom line. For-profit companies obviously all have a bottom line. They measure their success in dollars and cents. Those of us who are working on a social cause or who work with a nonprofit, our main concern isn't a financial bottom line, but we can still and should still have a bottom line. A bottom line is not dollars and cents, but what is it? I run an animal advocacy organization, and our bottom line is this: to save as many animal lives as possible and to reduce as much animal suffering as possible. Whatever your cause is, chances are your bottom line is something along the lines of reducing human suffering, improving human happiness, reducing environmental destruction, improving environmental protection, and so on and so forth. A bottom line is something that's quantifiable. We can put numbers on it. Our nonprofit can figure out the number of animals we helped. An organization designed to provide clean drinking water to those in Africa can measure the number of people who now have clean water and, more importantly, the number of people who are not getting and dying from waterborne diseases. Environmental organizations can measure the number of CO2 emissions that were not released into the atmosphere because of their work. Social justice organizations can measure the number of workers who are now being paid a living wage. Gay rights advocates can measure the number of states that have passed pro-equality legislation. Point being, whatever our social cause, we need to figure out what our bottom line is, what we can put a number to, a number that reflects a real change in the world, a change that reduces suffering and death and destruction and increases happiness and life and preservation. Once we figure out what our bottom line is, we can then compare different issues and different tactics to figure out which will have the biggest and most beneficial impact on our bottom line. Using a bottom line approach cuts through dissenting opinions about, well, I like to work on this issue and she likes to work on that issue, or this is what I feel most comfortable doing. And it helps us get past that attitude of, as long as we're doing something, we're on the right path. By setting a bottom line for us and our efforts, we can be exponentially more effective at creating actual, real-world change. For your own efforts, I strongly encourage you to check out Change of Heart. Change of Heart lists over 50 research-proven tools and techniques that any advocate for a cause can use to be more effective in their work. It also goes into more depth about how our own psychology can either help or hurt our efforts at spreading change. Change of Heart also has several chapters that discuss why it's so hard to convince others to adopt more compassionate attitudes and behaviors, those psychological stumbling blocks that we often run up against when trying to speak to our family, our friends, or the general public about a cause that matters so much to us. Change of Heart also talks about how we can use social networks to more effectively spread social change. And it talks about how new attitudes and behaviors typically spread through a society. Change of Heart also details social marketing, or how nonprofits and advocates can use marketing-type tools to spread their message to the public. Thank you for your time. Thanks for checking out changeofheartbook.com. And thank you for helping to create a better world.